Tiziano Vecelli, whose name we've anglicized to Titian, is probably the best known Venetian painter. Now, I want you to be sure, if we were to spell his name, that you spell it correctly. You'll notice that there's two I's, T-I-T-I-A-M. Sometimes students will spell it without the second I, which is Titan, the primeval giants. And I would say that Titian is a titan of art, a giant of art, but you still need that second I for his name. Tiziano Vecelli, called Titian. The most famous Venetian artist. He was the favorite painter of the Emperor Charles V. This is the Holy Roman Emperor. And there's a wonderful story that is told about Titian and Charles. They say that when Charles was visiting Titian's studio, Titian dropped the brush and Charles, the conqueror, picked up the brush for him. Now, I don't know if that ever happened or not. If it did, I'm quite certain that Charles knew his literary reference. He wasn't just performing a menial task to say that he respected his painter so much. There's a story told of Apelles and Alexander the Great, in which Apelles drops the brush and Alexander, the conqueror of the world, picks up his brush. So by picking up the brush, it would make Charles Alexander and Titian Apelles, the great painter. Titian is famous for his colore. He painted all the different media that were used. He has painted frescoes, some of which were in Padua, so they survived better than the ones in Venice, where it's just too wet. He painted oil on panel, for example, his great altarpiece of the Assunta, the Assumption of the Virgin, in the Church of the Friary, the Franciscan church in Venice. It's an altarpiece on panel because it's not hanging on a wall. But most of his works are oil on canvas. And this, now I should warn you, this image is not actually by Titian. It's an artist who is taking a detail from a painting by Titian and redrawing and painting to show you the steps in the process of creating his works of art. So those are not actually Titian's brushstrokes or Titian's drawings, but just a diagram in a sense. Titian painted with oil on canvas. He would start with a sealed white canvas. This would probably be gesso. And then he would apply a base coat or a ground of warm reddish brown. He said that it gave warmth to the colors. And then he'd do his underdrawing and start to build up the light areas with white lead paint. In some of his later works, after about the middle of the 16th century, he sometimes uses a very thick paint, an impasto, and you kind of see the word paste in that, which just means very, very thick paint. And then he would start to apply layers of oil glazes. These were called his veilatura, his veilings. And he's supposed to have said 30, 40, veilature, layers of oil glazes, just many, many layers. Obviously, in a damp climate, using oil glazes, he can't just keep painting all day on the same painting. He has to let the glazes dry completely. So he was supposed to have turned the painting so we couldn't see them. And then later, a month later or whenever, he comes back and he looks at the painting and they say he glared at it like it was his own worst enemy. So he would be working on a lot of work at the same time, letting some dry, others applying glazes. And he seems to have been his own critic, as you can see. The earliest works by Titian look very much like works by Giorgione, and sometimes there are attribution controversies. We believe that both of them were pupils of Giovanni Bellini, and that they were friends. And there is actually we know at least on one occasion that Titian finished the last painting that Giorgione began, the Sleeping Venus. And sometimes people think that they might have even collaborated. But we're going to look at something a little bit later, the Pesaro Madonna, or simply a Madonna and Child with saints and donors. And of course, the donor is Signor Pesaro. And you see here male members of the Pesaro family kneeling to the Virgin Mary. You'll also notice that on the left, you see this great flag, and beneath it, there's a man holding it in armor, and then there's another man with a turban. This painting commemorated a Venetian naval victory over the Turks. The Turks and the Venetians were both great naval powers. They vied for supremacy in the Mediterranean. And I assume some of you have read Othello, and you'll remember that the enemy there were the Turks. And so on this occasion, there was a naval battle. And it looked like the Venetians were going to be defeated. Ships would be sent to the bottom of the sea. They prayed to the Virgin Mary, and lo and behold, the tide of battle turned, and the Venetians were victorious. And they gave credit for their victory to the intervention of the Virgin Mary. So here she is portrayed in a painting with a reference to that battle. Of course, this is also on the altar where masses would be said for the souls of members of the Pesaro family. We talked about it at the very beginning of class as our example of an asymmetrical composition. In other words, a composition which is not the same on both sides, and your center of interest might even be off on one side. So here we see Mary and the baby Jesus on one side raised up as the apex of what seems to be a kind of right-angle triangle, with St. Peter as the hypotenuse, looking down as the Virgin looks down to Signor Pesaro as he kneels below. And of course, our eye is drawn to Mary. She's not only the apex of that triangle, but she's got the lightest color, the white veil, these bright colors of the blue and red. And although she's balanced by the big flag, having figures in complicated poses. It's so much more interesting to look at. You'd rather look at human beings. Human beings seem to be hardwired to do that. We just naturally start looking at images of human beings. So that draws our eye. You might even notice that the cloud behind Mary almost serves as a little pointer toward her. And then you see the Christ child's very lively. He almost seems to be doing a little dance as he plays with his mother's veil, sort of unveiling, revealing himself to St. Francis of Assisi, whose hands stretch out over toward the other members of the Pesaro family and display his wounds, of course. Up at the top, you've got little angels up on clouds, and they're holding the cross, reminding us that Christ will sacrifice himself. Now, usually when we think about the Renaissance, we think about symmetrical compositions, and this is true for most Renaissance paintings. However, in 16th century Venice, more and more of the paintings are asymmetrical. Not every Venetian painting is asymmetrical. There are some that are symmetrical, but more and more of them are. It seems to be a much more dramatic way to organize your painting. It gives us the sensation of some kind of movement. And then later, in the 17th century, asymmetry becomes really a characteristic of Baroque art. Just many, many paintings are asymmetrical in the 17th century. Where do they get it? Well, quite probably from looking at Venetian art from the 16th century. Titian painted all sorts of subjects. He painted religious subjects, he painted classical subjects, and he's also very well known for painting portraits. And here they're showing you his portrait of Isabella d'Este. Now, I suspect they picked this portrait because they wanted us to talk about Isabella d'Este as an art patron.